could you just describe your role as a student at Westport and what that environment was like?
Yeah, my role at Westport was actually, I think, pivotal in setting the stage for the direction of my career. And it was one of the first experiences I had to, and the first opportunity I had to actually engage in citizen activism. So as a student at Westport, I actually started at Lincoln High School and decided that I wanted to transfer to Westport because my cousin was at Westport, you know, little reasons that had nothing to do with anything other than, I think I want to go to Westport, right? And so my mom agreed to that and allowed me to get the transfer. So I rode public transportation. I was not bused to Westport. So I took the city bus to Westport every day. As a student at Westport, it became very obvious to me that the quality of education that I was receiving at Lincoln High School did not compare to the quality of education that I received at Westport High School at the time, which was predominantly white. All of the teachers, or most of the teachers, were white. The administrators, there was one African American vice principal at the school. They had a multitude of extracurricular activities that were both athletic as well as academic. Extracurricular activities such as literary societies and things that I had never heard of while attending Lincoln High School. What was missing from Westport High School was any recognition or validation of the Latino and African American community of students. So as a student at Westport, I was involved in a movement to get the school to allow us to have a Black History assembly during Black History Month. And to achieve that, we actually had to stage sit-ins in the hallways and, you know, refused to go to class. And thankfully I had a mom who was just an activist as well, so she allowed me, I was not punished for skipping school, getting in trouble, sitting in, and we prevailed in our activism and had a Black History program, put that in place. I don't know how long that continued after I graduated from Westport, but that was pretty much my experience. I noticed that, you know, at Lincoln, I had really high grades and a high GPA. My first semester at Westport, my GPA dropped. My academic performance, it was a lot more difficult initially. It took me a semester or grading period or so to adjust, and then I got my grades, you know, back up, and I participated in a lot of activities and things. But it was certainly much more academically rigorous, as well as the quality of extracurricular activities and everything that was provided for us was significantly better. So at that time, education was most definitely separate and unequal.
Okay, so you saw the curriculum better at Lincoln?
At Westport.
At
At Westport.
Okay, quite interesting.
The quality of instruction, the materials, resources that were at our disposal were better than what I had experienced at Lincoln. I would attribute that to racism and discrimination.
So what in terms of the teaching staff at Lincoln, what did that look like?
It was primarily African American. And they were, I mean, I had some really great teachers. And well, the difference in terms of the instruction, certainly I felt like the teachers at Lincoln cared more about my progress, many of them. I think what they lacked was access to the resources that they needed to impart the same type of experiences that we had at Westport, you know. So I had some very good teachers at Lincoln. I'm not saying that, but I do know that the quality of what was available at Westport far exceeded what was available at Lincoln at that time.
Okay. So when you think about Kansas City, what do you recall as the efforts that were put into place to integrate schools?
So when I think about the desegregation or the integration of Kansas City public schools, I remember the court-ordered desegregation plan requiring requiring Kansas City Public Schools to integrate, and then apparently revenues being provided for that, and nearly $3 billion or more being invested in an effort that was unsuccessful. But the revenues were used to upgrade facilities and create magnet themes with the desire or the hope to attract white students to the district. That did not work, and but it was a lot. They established magnet themed schools such as Central Academy, I think was the Greek Academy, and they put in the Olympic size swimming pools, and they did all these things. They invested in facilities and bricks and mortar, and failed to invest in what are much more important priorities to provide a quality education. And because I believe that the real magnet is schools that learn, high achieving schools are attractive to all parents irrespective of race. But I think that's where Kansas City Public Schools missed the mark. They did not invest enough in teacher development. They did not invest enough in creating 21st century education models. Our focus was on our basic experience at that school and what that felt like for us with regard to integration and inclusion at that school. What was interesting back then was certainly the African American students were much more vocal, as we have been throughout the civil rights movement, which has oftentimes created some friction between the African American and the Latino community, because African Americans we've always felt like we step up and we'll get in the fight, and Latinos would be much more docile and not so, reticent to join into our protests. And the same was true at Westport when we were there. I mean, we had Latino students, many of whom were friends of mine, but when it came to the sit-ins and the protesting that was needed, many of them did not engage. But now I've come to understand that to be pretty much a cultural difference in terms of how they view authority and their elders and how they approach their activism. So with regard to the role that I played in school integration, I think it began at Westport as a student and playing a role in creating the opportunity for us to celebrate Black History Month with an African American Black History celebration program. After that, I went to college, and I went to MU, which, at the time that I was at MU, there was a Confederate rock on campus, and the fraternities that, would hang the Confederate flag out. And so MU is still experiencing problems. The Confederate rock has been removed, but as a college student, I was involved in activism. I've learned through that voice of that experience at college to speak up and show up for sit-ins or protests, that type of thing. But coming back to Kansas City, my role as a president of the Urban League has been, we are a civil rights and human services organization, and so we have a focus on achieving equality in education, health, economic, social justice, and in civic engagement. And so our role has always been to be an advocate for quality education, for diversity and inclusion, and we've, for the past 30, 40 years, been intimately involved in issues with the Kansas City Public Schools. And so during the desegregation case, we gave voice to the need to include all students in the plan. There were some major discrepancies in the deseg model, which this whole magnet plan to attract white students was really in the early stages at the expense of black students who lived in the district, were being denied access to some of the better schools while seats sat vacant, waiting with the hope that white students would come, and they never did. And so that created a lot of discontent in the community, and so there were protests and disruptions of Kansas City school board meetings, and with our cry being that, you know, our kids deserve a quality education no matter what, and they should not be denied access while we wait for white kids to come, and that we don't believe that our kid has to sit next to a white student to have a quality education. So we gave voice and supported that movement as well. From in the early 80s, I was not at the Urban League. I was working I was a YMCA professional. And part of that time I was even, for a year, 85, 86, I was in Mississippi. And so my contact with the school then, with the district, was through work at the Y, and we had programs in Central, East, and Northeast, I believe, high schools. As my daughter attended Casey Public Schools while the DSEG plan was still, well, she was born in 83, yeah, so she was in the system before they exited the case. She was in the system. And she attended schools that were part of the magnet thing. So she graduated from Lincoln College Prep. So she attended Lincoln Middle, Lincoln College. She attended Swinney and Volker, which were all schools that had magnet themes and were excellent schools. So they didn't totally miss that thing. So what I'm struggling with is knowing at what point in this process did the overall student achievement outcomes for the district start to plummet, and where they were in this perpetual cycle of either, you know, of provisional accreditation to de-accreditation, which has spanned several years. Right. But what they did do was, you know, in the Lincoln, in that cluster, Swinney, Volker, Lincoln cluster, because that was basically the logical progression. If your child went to Swinney, it was highly likely that they were going to, you know, the feeder, they were a feeder to Volker, and Volker was a feeder to Lincoln, because most of the students that started with that high quality, Swinney was one of the best schools in the nation, all of those schools actually. Lincoln continues to stay ranked very high, slipped some slippage this past year, but those schools had teachers, say for, I know my daughter's French teacher was hired to come here from France. And so she had a very good teacher, you know, in terms of the foreign language courses at Lincoln. They hired the best teachers. But what I think where the thing was missed was these schools only invested in the magnet theme schools, and maybe the inequitable allocate the traditional schools not getting any you know, resources. So they created within their own system a separate and unequal system, which, you know, process for educating kids that has, you know, been a problem. And I actually had a choice. You know, many parents who live in the inner city do not have that choice. At the time that my child was entering the school system, I chose to put her, you know, and my thing, I approached it from the standpoint of, she gets into Swinney and she'll be educated in Kansas City Public Schools. If we don't get into Swinney, we're going private. You know, but many parents don't have that option, right? So we chose Kansas City Public Schools, we felt that that was the best education, and I believe she got an excellent education because she did the logical progression, or she matriculated the system from Swinney to Volker to Lincoln Middle to Lincoln Prep. And of course, Lincoln Prep you had to test into, which is another challenge for many families whose children could not test in. That also created some feelings of the haves or the have-nots, or that it's somehow, it's exclusive. I think the school system, in this plan, they missed the opportunity to use those resources. While yes, you can have a college prep academy and create a selection process or entry requirements based on academic performance, but it is incumbent upon any public school system to prepare every child to be college ready, to be either prepared for a college education or a career, or to branch out and become an entrepreneur. They should be academically prepared when they graduate high school. So in practice, every school should be a college prep school. I don't think it's had any I don't think it had any impact on our community. I think the way that our community is currently positioned and the design of our city is what actually was an impediment to school integration. The reality is that, and I believe it was unachievable because of the very sad reality that most white parents are reticent to have their children attend any public school or any school where they are not in the majority. And so so if we look at the trend towards the Southland corridor with Border Store, and what you see happening is, it's like the Hale Cook school, for instance. They needed to carve out a special school for them where they are in the majority, then they're comfortable accessing public schools. But at any point when there's a tipping point, I'm not sure exactly what the percentage of the population is, but when that occurs, white parents flee. So the whole notion of school integration is what led to the demise, or the downgrading of Kansas City Public Schools. When you have to go back to Brown versus Board of Education. The schools were predominantly white. After Brown versus the Board of Education, you have, as long as they were able to still be separate, where the white schools were there and the black schools were there, then you had a different system. With deseg came white flight, and then following white flight came black middle class flight. And so the system is just fundamentally flawed and is not going to, no matter what, I don't believe, no matter what the Kansas City Public School system does, it's not going to bring any large numbers of white parents or students back into the system. And now we have this whole, this Southwest movement. It's like Unified Southwest. I'm not sure the exact name of the movement. I'm drawing a blank on it right now. But there's this group of wealthy white men who are trying to create a movement to get access to Southwest so they can recreate, so that they have a high school for white kids west of Troost. So, the saga continues. But basically the reality is that because race relations, we as a country, and certainly as a city, which ranks high, I think in the upper 1/3 of the most segregated cities in the country, we have not addressed that major root cause for these, our inability to fully integrate our schools. So the premise would be that if you had a high functioning public school system with high quality neighborhood schools, that would spawn or foster integration. Well, you have to start with integrated neighborhoods with mixed with a diversity of social and economic backgrounds to generate high quality neighborhood schools. And so I don't think we're going to get there in the current configuration.
Right. What changes do you think are needed to improve outcomes for students in today's urban schools?
I believe several changes are needed to improve outcomes for students in today's urban schools. And knowing that teacher quality is is the number one indicator of student success, I believe we need to start with better preparing our teachers for teaching in urban schools. And I think we need to do more work at the higher education level to have more rigorous admission standards for teachers and to better prepare them to teach in inner city schools with training specific to implicit bias, training specific to understanding cultural differences, especially how Black children and brown children communicate and what they value, so that when they enter these classrooms, they know how to build strong relationships with their students and thereby being better able to manage the classroom environment and foster high quality student performance. With regard to parental involvement, I think that while parental involvement is very important in achieving student outcomes, it is not the number one factor. But it is important that we have parents who are engaged in the education process, who have the ability and the resources to have impact and influence on the system within which they educate their children. And I think what's unfortunate about Kansas City Public Schools is that during the desegregation era, we experienced both white flight and we experienced the flight of the Black middle class. And I believe that if we were to achieve a return of the Black middle class, we would have stronger schools, because when we show up to advocate for our children with our skills, our experience, and our education backgrounds, we then become advocates for those children whose parents lack the capacity or the ability to come in and speak up on behalf of their children. I think it's a missing element. It was there before, and you see it and I've seen the benefit of it as a parent advocate for students when my child was in the system, and my colleagues whose children were educated in Kansas City Public Schools, we showed up, and therefore our schools were held accountable. We visit classrooms, we talk to the principal, we'd get a bad teacher removed, we'd get a bad principal removed. We did the work that parents should have the voice and the ability to do, but we need the Black middle class to return.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with us about school integration in Kansas City?
Well, a big concern I have about school integration right now is this Southwest Corridor movement to create a school that for white students with, I believe it's someone, Stowers, Block, and I can't think of the name of the other person right now, but who are wanting to put $25 million into Southwest to create a high school west of Truce. But if their real goal is about diversity and inclusion, as they say, and quality education, then they would make a gift of $25 million to the Kansas City Public Schools to build a high quality high school for all students and allow that process to take place, driven by Dr. Bedell and the Kansas City Public School Board. So there's this, it appears that this, while they claim they want a diverse and inclusive process, what they are promoting is an exclusive process ultimately that they can control, because they want this to be an autonomous school that they decide, so that they can control admissions, and that's really scary to me. I think we're taking the system backwards.